Hello again, my name is Steve Hillis and this video continues right where we cut off from the last video. We're talking about trends, patterns of crime in the United States. Now let's talk a little bit about how crime patterns and trends vary across different racial and ethnic groups and vary across men and women. Looking at the relationship between crime and race, crime and ethnicity, crime and gender. Well, here we're looking at violent crime arrest rates from the mid-2000s, I believe it's 2006. And you'll notice that violent crime arrest rates for African Americans are much higher than for whites. We can see something very similar when we look at property crime arrest rates for African Americans and whites. I'm simply using blacks and whites to illustrate a more general point, which is that arrest data varies tremendously according to different races and ethnicities. And by the way, whites don't have the lowest arrest rates when it comes to crime, when it comes to racial or ethnic groups. You tend to find that Asian Americans have even lower rates of arrest than whites. And again, we have 2006 data, and this is based on census data and also data taken from the FBI. Now, here are some estimated, really old estimates, estimated lifetime chance of someone going to jail. These estimates again come from 2001, so they're quite dated, but they still capture something that would be true today. That depending on your race or ethnicity, your chances of spending time in jail sometime during your life are greatly different. And they were estimating way back then that African Americans were something like, what, 7 times more likely to spend time in jail compared to white Americans. And again, I have to be careful here because we're talking about African American males compared to white males. Now, if you look at individual crimes, you also see very large differences in terms of who was arrested for what crime according to their race and ethnicity. Again, I'm going to stick with making comparisons between blacks and whites, but we could go through the same exercise looking at other racial or ethnic groups as well. We're just trying to take a shortcut here and, well, make a few quick comparisons. But again, if you look at other groups, you will find other disparities between them. You'll notice some differences. Oh, before we get into that, this originally, of course, was a color-coded graph. When we changed it to overhead, it turned black and white on us. And we got cheap and we didn't color copy it. But it still should be pretty easy for you to read. The taller bar to the left in each pair shows African Americans. The shorter bar in each pair to the right shows white Americans. And again, this is broken down by type of crime. You're looking at arrests per 100,000 people in the U.S. And you'll notice for crime after crime, murder, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, burglary, larceny, motor vehicle theft, weapons-related charges, drug abuse or drug-related charges, and prostitution. You'll notice substantial differences between these racial groups in terms of their arrest rates. Now, it's not as simple as saying that it's all about race, because race and gender interact in profound ways. In this case, we're looking not at arrest data, but we're looking at victimization data. In particular, the relationship between race, gender, and homicide victimization rates for young people, people 18 to 24. This data is from 2005, and these are numbers per 100,000. What is your chance of being killed, being murdered? It will be affected not just by your race, but by your gender and how the two interact. Remember, African American males were more likely to be arrested for homicide. They're also more likely to be victims of homicide as well, and that shows up big time in this graph. The number or the rate of homicides for young African American males is disturbingly high. It's so much lower for young white males. But you'll notice also, for African American females, it's also much lower. In fact, the chances of an African American female being killed are actually slightly lower than for a white male. But the lowest probability or the lowest percentage or the lowest rate of homicides are found among white females. Huge differences, not just across race, but also across gender. Some combinations produce very, very high rates of victimization, some combinations very low rates of victimization, and still other combinations produce kind of moderate, intermediate levels. Your race, your gender, your ethnicity will affect the probability that you will be arrested for a crime, also the probability that you will be a victim of such a crime. Now, part of the reason that homicide rates, when we look at this data, we're looking at African American men, for example, being arrested for certain kinds of crime, including homicide at a very high rate, also being likely to be victims of homicide at a very high rate. Why? Well, part of the reason is that most crime, especially most violent crime, occurs within racial or ethnic groups. And that's probably nowhere clearer than with homicides. Here we're looking at the percent of white homicide victims killed by white offenders, black offenders, and members of another race, 2006. And we're looking at a narrower version of this, actually single victim, single offender homicide. So we're not looking at mass murders, for example. The vast majority of whites who are homicide victims are killed by other whites. Only about 15%, a little over 15% of white homicide victims appear to be killed by an African American, and only about 3% of white homicide victims are killed by someone of yet another race or ethnicity, which means that well over 80% of white homicide victims are killed by another white person. That general rule holds across racial and ethnic groups. When a person is murdered, usually they're murdered from someone of their own race or their own ethnicities. This is true for Black Americans, it's true for Hispanic Americans, it's true for Asian Americans, and so forth. Murder and a lot of other violent crimes, to a lesser degree some property crimes, tend to occur within racial groups or categories. Now we're not, again, talking just about race here. We also want to talk about gender. And here we're looking at some FBI data from 2006 to make a simple point. If you look at who is arrested for various types of crime, men are arrested at much, much higher rates than women. And presumably men are committing a lot more crimes. You can see this is true across crimes. For example, with murder and non-negligent manslaughter, close to 90% of all arrests are men, slightly over 10% women. Rape, 98.7% of those arrested are men. Robbery, 88.7%. Aggravated assault, close to 80%. Burglary, 85%. The numbers drop when we look at larceny and theft, but still the majority of such arrests are men, 62.3%. Motor vehicle theft, 82.3%. And finally, arson, 83%. For the vast, vast majority of serious crimes, men dominate them. Now, let's see here. I guess we will move on and take a quick glance at some historical data to point out that these gender differences are long-lasting and frankly, they're largely cross-cultural. Here we're looking at some old historic data from Chicago, homicide rates broken down by gender and by age. We'll kind of sneak in something talking about age here. Here we're looking at the age of the killer along this axis, and we're looking at the homicide rates. We can also look at whether the killer was a female, that's this red curve here, or whether they were male, which is captured by this big dark curve. First of all, we're looking at historical data. It's broken down by age and by gender, and you can see homicide rates per million annually vary tremendously by both gender and age. Most killers are fairly young. Murderers are usually in their late teens, early 20s, some of them in their 30s and 40s. But as people age, they quickly become less and less likely to commit serious violent crimes, including homicide. But we also see vast differences between men and women, and that's what we want to emphasize here. Women tend to be arrested, convicted, and incarcerated for crimes like homicide at vastly lower rates than men. Again, this is historic data from 1965 to 1990 from a single city in the United States, Chicago, Illinois. This figure, on the other hand, is much older and is from a different country. Here we're looking at England and Wales from 1842 to 1844. A short period of time, to be sure, but one in a different country that shows remarkably similar patterns. Here again, we're looking at homicide rates, actually in this case, criminal offender rates, per 100,000. You'll notice that criminals tend to be in their 20s, teens, 20s, 30s. Same relationship, lots of younger criminals, very few much older criminals. Also, once again, we have this red curve here showing women who were defined as criminal offenders. And then we have this much larger dark curve indicating men. Notice that across all age groups, all of them, women are less likely than men to be criminal offenders. That was true in Wales and England back in the 1800s. It was true in Chicago in the 60s through the 90s. And it's true in most industrialized countries today and 100 years ago and 200 years ago. These gender differences are large, they're powerful, they're persistent. Now, that doesn't mean they don't change. Here we're looking at women's percentage of all Part 1 criminal arrests, 1993 and 2006. The number or the percentage of women arrested for serious crimes has gone up. It's gone up from 1993 to 2006. So again, I'm not suggesting that these gender relationships are fixed in any way, or at least they're not totally fixed, but they are stubborn things. Once again, you can see the increase in females being arrested in the United States from 2000 to 2010. You can see that here, and you can see the longer-term trend from 1960 to 2010. You can see that more and more women